Warning, this video uses naughty words and mum jokes to add colour to an otherwise bleak video. If you don't like it, then f*** off. It was 2012 and I was up in the Lake District on holiday. I had to survive 2 weeks without the internet. And you know what? I didn't miss it at all. Without the distractions, I developed superhuman patience and could appreciate all of my old favourite games again on my cheap little laptop. But I also started my most ambitious project ever. It didn't have a name, but for the sake of this video, I'll call it the Turing Test. I wanted to make a program that could communicate with people. The end goal was to make a game set in a city where you have to speak with people to locate something. I never got that far with it. I was more interested in the communication aspect. Don't get me wrong, I knew before I even started that I was going to fail. If decades of text adventures couldn't manage it, there was no chance for me. But I wanted to give it a go, if for no other reason than to appreciate the difficulties that computers have in understanding people and why text adventure games fail to understand even the simplest of commands. And my project did fail, but not for the reasons I had expected. The first step was to get it to understand individual words, which is actually really easy. You assign each letter a number. For example, the word no would be 14 for the N, 15 for the O, with the space after it marking the end of the word. Once you submit your message, the scanner identifies that 14 followed by 15 and then a space means no. And with that, it already understands more than spoilt children do. Once it recognised a word, it would then create a block representing it underneath. It would do this to every word, so a 10-word sentence would become 10 individual blocks. These blocks remembered what the exact word was, but they would also assign it to one of 11 different categories to try and simplify things. This was important. I wasn't trying to get it to understand every combination of 1,000 different words. I just wanted it to recognise roughly what the person was saying from the word pattern within a sentence. For example, if you typed, "Where is the cinema?" it would identify where as the question, is and the as pointless joining words, and cinema as an item. In other words, that whole sentence has been simplified down to question item. The NPC knows that the player is asking about a physical object in the game. Once it knows that, it can then look at the specific words to identify what sort of question it is and which sort of item, and reply accordingly. I suspect that this is pretty much how text adventure games work. At this point, I was quite optimistic about the project and felt that I could get a reasonably successful system working. Of course, the program needed to understand tens of thousands of different words. I suspect that someone somewhere could link it up to a dictionary or thesaurus in some way. I only included 91 in this project, but it was easy and very rewarding to add more to it. I would happily have added thousands of entries if I thought it would have worked, but I didn't bother since this wasn't the reason it failed. I'll tell you why it did. You see, having made this project, I knew how to type things that the computer understood it. I know how to find things on Google, for example. Computers like simple, literal sentences and get easily confused when things stray off the beaten path. Which is why, the moment I let my dad try the program, this project became exponentially more difficult. He spoke to it like a person. He spammed it with small talk, he used rhetorical questions and jokes, to which the computer would respond literally. Let's take the sentence, "Your mum is good in bed." Those words are all positive. How is the computer supposed to know that you're insulting it? Well, you could argue that it is a positive phrase, but the reality is that when a stranger comes up to you in the street and says this, you're not supposed to be happy. You can't label mum and bed as insulting words, because in other situations, they won't be. But so what? In the grand scale of things, only a small percentage of messages would contain these sorts of situations. You could still hold a decent conversation with an NPC who takes everything literally. You haven't lived until you've talked dirty to a text adventure game. I bet developers like rude words as well. It's easy to program responses to insults like fuck and shit, and they were among the first I added to my Turing Test program. But they raise another problem. Take the following question. Where is the fucking cinema? How would you, let alone a computer, respond to that? I think you'd agree it's down to context. Context is everything. You'd listen to how those words were said. Where is the fucking cinema is confrontational and intimidating, whereas where is the fucking cinema is almost funny in its appropriateness. But how do you program a computer to understand this? To prioritise some words over others, perhaps depending on whether the player was carrying a gun or running away from an explosion. And we're just dealing with the first sentence spoken here. If you think developing a response for that is hard, just you wait until you begin tackling conversations. This is really where computers fall down. Not just understanding what you're typing, but knowing how it applies to everything you've previously said. Let's use the simplest example I can think of. If you say something like, "Do you know the fucking cinema?" and by some miracle the computer understands and replies with yes, it has to remember that you're still referring to the cinema when your next message is, "Where is it?" Using a set tree system only gets you so far. Somehow, the computer needs to remember the right bits of information so that it understands future sentences. How does it know when the conversation has changed direction? What if at some point it suddenly gets offended about a swear word you said a while ago? It's not that it isn't impossible to code for, but it means adding yet more complexity to the game's engine, simply to deal with the off chance that this situation might arise. But when you consider that there might be a million different quirks to the language like this, but slightly different, and that every one you prepare for could accidentally activate instead of a normal response, the system collapses under its own weight. Imagine having a lovely chat with the NPC for half an hour, only for a misunderstanding to make it immediately hate you just because it prioritised one word over another. It would render the conversation up to that point totally redundant. I'd feel betrayed and cheated. You can't prepare for the billion different ways a conversation could go. You can't prepare for humans, and you can't boil words down into just one of 11 different types. And I hadn't even started with how the computer's meant to respond and choose its own words, even if it does understand what it's been told. I don't know what I was expecting to achieve from this project. I wasn't naive enough to think that I could manage it, but at the same time, I still wasn't prepared for how hard it would be, and how epic and impossible this undertaking would become. How could I expect to simplify such a complicated system into a few lines of code? Something that was made by humans, for humans, and yet still takes us a lifetime to learn. I never liked languages at school. My French was terrible. I remember in my spoken exam, I had to talk about what I did with my friends at the weekend. It was the basic affair of visiting the cinema, eating bonbons and so on, but our teacher liked to improvise a bit, and I'm sure that she asked me what I liked to do with my friends behind the cinema. Not in, but behind. Or maybe it was after, I just don't know. The microphone was running and I was sat there, scanning my brain for responses. I couldn't think of anything. I just said that I liked playing with them, to which my teacher nodded and then carried on to the next question. Now, I'm the teacher, and my program's the stupid little language student sat in the interrogation seat. I know that it's basic and is challenged by simple, on-rails conversations. At best, it will scrape by from issuing generic, yet passable responses. And if it tries to be clever, I know what to say that will make it crash and burn. Computers have many strengths, but communication currently isn't one of them. Text games, search engines and Siri are interesting attempts, but they avoid the real problem by targeting specific words and by avoiding conversations at all costs. I can't even comprehend what would be needed to get beyond this stage. The more I scratched the surface with this project, the more I realised it wasn't going to work, and I didn't get far. I didn't further human knowledge in this area, but it gave me a whole lot more respect for the problem. Computers will eventually get there, but I suspect only once we teach them how to learn it for themselves. And you know what? I reckon this will be done by humans who have struggled the most with it themselves.